The bell above the door of Vance Antiquarian Books was a liar. It chimed with a delicate, silver brightness that promised whimsy, maybe a shop filled with colorful children's stories and friendly, bustling staff. The reality was a deep, sonorous quiet, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of printed words and the scent of slow, respectable decay. Leather, paper, binding glue, and the faint, clean smell of lemon polish on old wood. For 3 years, this quiet had been the bedrock of my world, a predictable, ordered universe in which I was a small, necessary cog. My job, officially, was clerk and bookkeeper. I managed the register, handled the accounts, and kept the ledgers in a hand so neat it bordered on obsessive. It was a role that suited me. It required precision and silence, 2 things I could offer in abundance. It did not require small talk or ambition, or the kind of easy confidence that seemed to come as naturally as breathing to other men my age. At 26, my life had been pared down to the essentials: a tiny, clean apartment, a stack of library books by my bed, and this job. It was a safe life. It was also profoundly lonely. The source of that safety, and the architect of this quiet world, was Mr. Arthur Vance. He was the owner, a man who existed more as a presence than a person in the daily life of the shop. He lived in the spacious apartment that took up the 2 floors above, and his appearances downstairs were rare, brief, and always purposeful. He was, I guessed, somewhere in his early 50s, with silvering hair at his temples and a stillness about him that could be mistaken for aloofness. But I'd seen the way his eyes, a deep and thoughtful gray, would soften when he handled a particularly beautiful first edition. It wasn't aloofness, it was a profound, internal focus. I harbored a secret, a quiet and persistent ache of attraction for him that I kept locked away like a rare manuscript. It was a foolish thing, a boy's crush on the distant, wealthy benefactor. He was my employer. He was decades my senior. He moved in a world of auctions and private collections, a world I could only glimpse through invoices and shipping manifests. My world was the worn brass of the cash drawer and the neat columns of the daily ledger. We were separated by a chasm of age, wealth, and experience. So I observed. From the safe distance of my tall stool behind the polished oak counter, I learned the rhythm of his life. I knew the sound of his footsteps on the floorboards above, a steady, measured tread. I knew he took his coffee black, because his housekeeper, Maria, would bring a thermos down on the rare days he worked in the small, glass-walled office at the back of the shop. I knew the scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of sandalwood and something clean, like cedar, that would linger in the air for a moment after he passed through. My yearning had a physical object associated with it, a tangible piece of my foolishness. It was the first ledger he had ever given me. It was bound in dark green leather, its corners worn smooth from use long before it came into my possession. On the first page, in his elegant, slanted script, he had written my name, Leo Thorne, and below it, the start date of my employment. I kept it in the bottom drawer of my desk, even though we'd long since moved to a more modern accounting system. Sometimes, at the end of a long, quiet day, I would take it out and trace the letters of my name, feeling the faint indentation of the pen, a fleeting connection to the hand that wrote it. It was a small, pathetic ritual, but it was mine. The change came on a Tuesday in late October. The air had turned crisp, and the afternoon light slanted low through the tall, mullioned windows of the shop, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air. Mr. Henderson, the shop's manager and the only other full-time employee, had announced his retirement the week before. He was a kind, fussy man who smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint, and his absence would leave a significant void. I was closing out the register for the day, the clink of coins the only sound in the cavernous space, when I heard the soft tread of Mr. Vance's shoes on the oriental rug behind me. Leo, his voice was low and calm, but it still made me jump. I turned, my hand automatically smoothing my shirt. Mr. Vance. I was just finishing up. He stood a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He wore a soft gray sweater that made his shoulders look broader than they did in his usual suit jackets. His gaze was direct, assessing, but not unkind. It was the look he gave a book when he was determining its value and its history. For a dizzying moment, I felt like a leather-bound volume he was considering for his collection. I know. I was hoping to have a word with you before you left, he said. He gestured toward the small back office. If you have a moment, my heart gave a nervous thud against my ribs. In 3 years, he had never asked me for a private word. Our interactions were polite, professional, and brief. Of course, I managed, my voice sounding thinner than I would have liked. I followed him, my own footsteps seeming clumsy and loud in comparison to his quiet grace. The office was his territory, neat and ordered just like the rest of the shop, but more personal. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, and the walls were lined with books, of course, but also framed maps of old cities and what looked like architectural drawings. He didn't sit behind the desk, which I was grateful for. Instead, he leaned against the corner of it, creating an atmosphere that was less formal, less of an employer summoning an employee. As you know, with Robert retiring, things will be changing, he began, his gray eyes fixed on my face. I won't be hiring a new manager immediately. I intend to take a more active role in the shop's daily operations for a while. I nodded, unsure what this had to do with me. I was a good bookkeeper, reliable. My position seemed secure. However, he continued, a separate matter has come up. I've recently acquired the entirety of the Callaway Estate Library. It's a significant private collection, and it needs to be inventoried, appraised, and cataloged before I can decide what to do with it. Much of it is stored upstairs. It's a massive undertaking, far more than I can handle alone in a timely manner. He paused, and the silence stretched. I watched him, my mind racing. I was trying to understand where this was going. He was a wealthy man. Surely he could hire a team of experts, appraisers from one of the big auction houses. The collection contains some sensitive documents, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Personal letters, journals. I require absolute discretion. I need someone I can trust. Someone meticulous. His gaze held mine, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. He was talking about me. Your work with the ledgers is impeccable, Leo. Your attention to detail is remarkable. The compliment landed with a soft, surprising weight. I felt a blush creep up my neck. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I would like to offer you a short-term contract, separate from your duties here in the shop, he said, his tone all business now. To assist me with the Callaway collection. The work would be after hours, in my private office upstairs. The pay would be substantial, to compensate you for the extra time and the confidentiality required. He named a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was more than 2 months of my regular salary for what he described as 6 to 8 weeks of work. It was an opportunity, a lifeline. The money would mean I could finally fix the rattling noise in my old car, maybe even build up a small cushion of savings, a buffer against the constant, low-grade anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck. But my mind wasn't on the money. It was on the words, upstairs, in his private office, assisting me. It was an invitation into his world, a world I had only ever observed from a distance. It was terrifying. It was everything I secretly wanted. You would, of course, have the choice to decline, he added, and his perception was so acute it was almost unnerving. He must have seen the hesitation, the conflict, in my eyes. There would be no professional repercussions. It is a significant request, and I understand if it's not something you wish to take on. He was giving me an out. He was making it clear that this was a choice, not a command. The ethical clarity of the offer was, in itself, a testament to his character. I took a breath. This is what I do. I stand on the edge of things and I watch. I don't participate. But his gaze was steady, patient, and in it, I saw not the authority of a boss, but a quiet, genuine request. I would be honored to help, Mr. Vance, I heard myself say. The words felt solid, real. A small, almost imperceptible change occurred in his expression. The tension around his eyes eased, and the corner of his mouth tilted upward in a faint, fleeting smile. Excellent, he said. And please, Leo, if we are to be working so closely, I think it's time you called me Arthur. The sound of his first name, spoken aloud in this quiet room, felt like a door swinging open on a hinge that had been rusted shut for a very long time. It was the beginning of something, and I had no idea what it was, but for the first time in years, the profound loneliness that defined my existence felt a little less absolute. The following Monday, my new routine began. I worked my usual shift in the shop, and as the final customer left and I turned the brass sign on the door to closed, a new kind of anticipation settled in my stomach. It was a nervous, fluttering energy that was entirely unfamiliar. I would lock the front door, turn off the main lights, and walk up the narrow, creaking staircase at the back of the building, the one marked private. The first time I ascended those stairs, my hand trailed along the smooth, cool wood of the banister. The air grew warmer, and the scent of old paper was joined by the faint aroma of brewed coffee and something else, something uniquely him. The sandalwood and cedar. It was the scent of his home. His private office was on the second floor, adjacent to what I assumed was his living area. It was even more impressive than the small office downstairs. It was a proper library, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a rolling ladder, and two deep leather armchairs flanking a fireplace. In the center was a massive oak library table, its surface already covered with carefully stacked books and archival boxes from the Callaway estate. The room was bathed in the warm, golden light of several green-shaded banker's lamps. It was a sanctuary. Arthur was standing by the table, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, examining a slim, leather-bound volume. He looked up as I entered, and the smile he offered was warmer, less guarded than the one he'd given me in the office downstairs. "Leo, welcome," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be absorbed by the books around us. "Please, make yourself comfortable. There's coffee on the sideboard if you'd like some." I suddenly felt clumsy and out of place in my worn trousers and slightly frayed sweater. He was dressed in dark, comfortable slacks and a cashmere pullover the color of charcoal. Everything about him, about this room, spoke of a quiet, understated wealth that was as natural to him as breathing. "Thank you," I said, my voice hushed. I poured myself a mug of coffee, my hands not quite steady. The porcelain was thin and delicate, nothing like the thick ceramic mugs in the shop's break room. Our work began slowly. He showed me the system he'd devised for cataloging. Each item was to be given a number, its condition noted, its title and author recorded, and any distinguishing marks or inscriptions transcribed. My job was the transcription, the careful recording of the data onto archival index cards and into a new, pristine ledger he provided. His job was the appraisal, the assessment of value and historical significance. We worked for hours that first night, mostly in a companionable silence. The only sounds were the soft rustle of turning pages, the scratch of my pen on the thick paper of the ledger, and the occasional quiet murmur from Arthur as he discovered something of interest. I found myself watching him more than I watched my own work. I watched his hands. They were large and well-kept, his fingers long and sure. He handled the fragile, crumbling books with a surgeon's care, his touch both firm and gentle. There was a deep respect in the way he interacted with these objects, a reverence for the stories they held. He would pause sometimes, holding a book open, his gaze distant. I wondered what he was thinking, what memories or knowledge a particular passage sparked in him. He was a man who contained entire libraries within himself, and I was only just beginning to read the introduction. Around 9 o'clock, he straightened up and stretched, rolling his shoulders. "I think that's enough for our first evening," he said. "We've made a good start." He looked at me, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "Thank you, Leo. Your handwriting is as clear as print. It's a pleasure to read." Again, the warmth bloomed in my chest. It was a simple, professional compliment, but coming from him, it felt like a gift. "I'm glad it's satisfactory," I said, my formality a shield. "More than," he said softly. "Go on home. Get some rest." Walking home that night through the cool, damp streets, the city felt different. The familiar loneliness was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by a new note, a quiet thrum of purpose and connection. I had been inside his world, and I was going back tomorrow. The evenings settled into a rhythm. I would close the shop, climb the stairs, and enter the warm, quiet world of his library. Arthur would already be there, and he would greet me with a quiet "Leo" and a nod. We fell into an easy, silent partnership. I learned to anticipate the tools he would need, a magnifying glass, a specific reference book from the shelves, and have them ready. He, in turn, seemed to learn my rhythms, placing a fresh pot of coffee on the sideboard just as I was starting to feel the late afternoon slump. The work was fascinating. We were unearthing a life through its collected objects. We found books with pressed flowers between their pages, their colors faded to gentle ghosts. We found volumes with passionate inscriptions in the margins, and others with ticket stubs from long-ago voyages tucked inside. And then there were the letters, tied in faded silk ribbons. As per our agreement, I never read them. I would simply note the date, the correspondent if it was visible, and the number of pages, before placing them in acid-free folders. But I would see Arthur read them, his expression growing somber, thoughtful. It felt like we were archaeologists of a single, intricate life. In our second week, we were standing side by side at the large table, examining a portfolio of botanical prints. They were exquisite, the colors still vibrant after more than a century. He was pointing out the delicate rendering of a fern's fronds, explaining the printing process. "You see here," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing against mine. A current, small but electric, shot through me. I froze, my entire being focused on that single point of contact. The warmth of his body seeped through the fabric of my sweater. He didn't pull away. He seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to mind. The aquatint process allows for such subtle gradations of tone, he continued, his finger tracing the edge of the print. His finger was less than an inch from my own. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to keep it even, to focus on his words and not on the riot of sensations erupting inside me. He finally straightened, and the contact was broken. The air rushed back into the space between us, feeling suddenly cool. He glanced at me, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a question in his eyes, a flicker of awareness. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, and he turned his attention back to the print. I spent the rest of that evening in a state of heightened awareness. Every time he moved near me, the fine hairs on my arms stood on end. I was analyzing everything. The way he paused before speaking, as if choosing his words with extra care. The way his gaze would sometimes linger on my face for a moment too long when he thought I wasn't looking. Was I imagining it? Was this just the product of my own foolish yearning, painting meaning onto innocent gestures? The power imbalance was a constant, nagging thought at the back of my mind. He was my boss. He was a wealthy, established man. I was a young, struggling clerk. The chasm between us was still there, and I was terrified of misinterpreting a simple act of collegial friendliness for something more. It would be a catastrophic mistake, one that could cost me my job, my security, the very foundation of my quiet life. So I said nothing. I retreated back into my shell of quiet professionalism, my pen scratching against the paper, my entries in the ledger neat and precise. But inside, a storm was brewing. A few nights later, the inevitable happened. We were working on a particularly fragile set of books, their spines crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. He passed one to me across the table, a slim volume of poetry. As I reached for it, our fingers brushed. It was a common enough accident, a fleeting contact. But then his fingers curled slightly, a soft, deliberate pressure against mine for a single, heart-stopping second before he pulled away. I looked up, my eyes wide, and met his gaze. There was no mistaking it this time. There was a warmth in his gray eyes, a depth of feeling that went far beyond professional courtesy. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the things we weren't saying. The silence stretched, filled with the frantic beating of my own heart. He was the one who broke it. He cleared his throat, a soft, low sound, and looked back down at the book in front of him. "Be careful with that one," he said, his voice a little rough. "The binding is quite delicate." It was a retreat, a return to the safety of our work. But it was also a confirmation. He had felt it too. That small, brief touch was not an accident. It was a question, and my sharp intake of breath, the way I was still staring at him, was my answer. The dynamic in the room had shifted. The comfortable silence was now laced with a fine, humming tension. It wasn't unpleasant. It was a thrum of awareness, a shared secret that lived in the space between us. We continued our work, but now, every movement was freighted with meaning. When he stood behind me to look at an entry in my ledger, I was intensely aware of his scent, of the warmth of his body so close to my back. When I handed him a folder, I was careful to let my fingers linger for a moment against his. We were communicating in a language without words, a conversation of proximity and fleeting touches. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I felt as though I were walking on a wire high above the ground, and the slightest misstep could send me plunging into the abyss of humiliation. But Arthur's presence was a steadying force. He never pushed, never presumed. Every small escalation was gentle, tentative, giving me ample space to retreat if I wished. But I didn't wish to. For the first time in my life, I wanted to step forward. The breakthrough, when it came, was precipitated by a shelf. It was an old, heavy oak barrister bookcase that we needed to move from one side of the library to the other to make room for another set of archival boxes. It was far too heavy for one person to handle. "All right," Arthur said, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt, revealing strong, lightly haired forearms. "Ready?" I nodded, taking my position on the other side. "On three," he said. "1, 2, 3, we lifted together. The old wood groaned in protest. It was incredibly heavy, and we had to shuffle sideways, our movements small and synchronized. "Easy," he grunted, his face set in concentration. "A little more to your left," I adjusted, my muscles straining. For 10 minutes, we were a team, a single unit with a single purpose. Our breathing was labored, our instructions to each other short and clipped. We had to trust each other completely, to anticipate the other's movements. When we finally settled the bookcase into its new position, we were both breathing heavily, leaning against the wall. "Well done," he said, a genuine smile on his face. He was looking at me with an open admiration that made my stomach swoop. "You too," I managed to say, wiping a sheen of sweat from my forehead. In that moment, the imbalance between us seemed to vanish. We weren't boss and employee. We were just two men who had accomplished a difficult task together. We had relied on each other, and we had succeeded. The feeling of partnership was potent. Later that week, a storm rolled in, a fierce autumn tempest that lashed the city with wind and rain. The lights in the library flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging us into a sudden, profound darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the city through the tall, rain-streaked windows. "Stay put." Arthur's voice came out of the blackness, calm and reassuring. "I have lamps." I heard him moving around the room with a sureness that told me he knew its landscape by heart. A moment later, there was the scratch of a match, and a soft, flickering flame bloomed in the darkness. He lit an old oil lamp on the table, its golden light pushing back the shadows and casting his face in dramatic relief. He proceeded to light 2 more, and soon the room was filled with a warm, dancing glow that felt ancient and intimate. "There," he said, his voice soft in the suddenly quiet room. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain against the glass and the faint hiss of the lamps. "I suppose our work is done for the night." I should have gone home. I should have thanked him and made my way down the dark stairs. But I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I was about to make some soup," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were watching me intently. "Nothing fancy, just tomato. You're welcome to stay and share it, if you'd like. No sense in walking home in this downpour until it lets up a bit." It was an invitation. A simple, kind gesture. But in the charged atmosphere of that storm-tossed, lamplit room, it felt like much more. "I'd like that very much," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We ate in the 2 leather armchairs by the cold fireplace, balancing bowls of hot, savory soup on our laps. He had produced a loaf of crusty bread and a bottle of red wine. It was the simplest meal, but it felt like a banquet. The storm raged outside, but in here, in our small bubble of light and warmth, there was a profound sense of peace. We talked. For the first time, we really talked. Not about books or ledgers, but about other things. He asked me about my studies in university, and he listened, truly listened, as I told him about my abandoned passion for history. I asked him how he came to own the bookshop, and he told me a story about inheriting it from his grandfather, a man who had taught him to love the feel and smell of old books. As the conversation flowed, I saw a different side of him. The stoic, reserved Mr. Vance was gone, replaced by Arthur, a man with a quiet humor and a deep well of kindness. He was still formidable, still possessed of an unshakable self-assurance, but there was a softness there I had never seen. At one point, he set his empty bowl aside and looked at me, his expression turning serious. The firelight carved shadows and highlights onto the planes of his face. "Leo," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Are you comfortable with this arrangement? With these late hours, working so closely together?" He paused, choosing his words with care. "I am your employer. I am acutely aware of that fact. The last thing I would ever want is for you to feel obligated or pressured in any way. His vulnerability struck me silent for a moment. He was voicing the very concerns that had been plaguing me, but he was doing it from a place of concern for my well-being. He was worried about being perceived as coercive, as taking advantage of his position. He was actively working to balance the power between us by naming it, by putting it on the table and giving me the chance to speak. It was an act of profound respect. I looked at him, at this good, decent man silhouetted against the flickering light, and I felt the last of my fear fall away. It was replaced by a wave of affection so strong it almost buckled me. I have never felt pressured, Arthur, I said, and my voice was steady, clear. I look forward to our evenings. More than I can say, the relief that washed over his face was palpable. He gave me a small, grateful nod. Good, he said softly. That's very good to hear. The door was open now. He had opened it, and I had walked through. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent, but the storm inside me had broken in a different way, clearing the air, leaving behind a clean, quiet certainty. Something real was happening between us, something built not on foolish fantasy, but on a foundation of mutual work, shared silence, and now, a moment of spoken, vulnerable truth. The incident that finally tipped the balance from unspoken to undeniable happened not in the quiet sanctuary of the upstairs library, but in the public space of the shop floor. It was a Wednesday afternoon, a week after the storm. The air was still and cool, the shop quiet except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I was behind the counter, processing a new shipment of books. The bell chimed, and a man I recognized as Mr. Sterling entered. He was a wealthy collector, known for his abrasive personality and his belief that his money entitled him to instant and fawning service. He strode to the counter and slapped a leather-gloved hand on its polished surface. "I need to see Vance," he said, not as a request, but as a demand. He didn't look at me, his gaze sweeping over my head as if I were a piece of furniture. "Mr. Vance is unavailable at the moment," I said, my voice polite but firm. "May I help you with something?" Sterling finally deigned to look at me, his eyes dismissive. "Unlikely. I'm here about the Hemlock First Edition. I was told it had arrived." "Yes, it has," I said. "It's being held for you. I can get it you." He let out a short, unpleasant laugh. "I'm not letting some shop boy handle a book of that value. Go get Vance." A hot flush of anger and humiliation rose in my cheeks. I had spent weeks handling books far more valuable and delicate than the Hemlock Edition. My hands were as careful as any in this city. But I kept my composure. As I said, "Sir, he is unavailable." "I am perfectly capable of." "I don't care what you think you're capable of," he snapped. "Your job is to run the register and fetch your boss when a real customer comes in. That will be quite enough." "Sterling," the voice came from the back of the shop. It was Arthur. He rarely came down to the floor during business hours, but there he was, standing near the back office, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was glacial. The easy warmth I had come to know in the library was gone, replaced by a formidable, protective stillness. Mr. Sterling's bluster deflated instantly. "Ah, Vance. There you are. I was just telling your boy here. His name is Leo," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerously calm as he walked toward the counter. "And he is not my boy, he is my colleague, and his knowledge of our inventory is second only to my own. If he tells you he is capable of assisting you, you will believe him. Or you can take your business elsewhere. It makes no difference to me." The silence in the shop was absolute. Sterling's face mottled with color, a mixture of shock and fury. He was not a man accustomed to being spoken to this way. He stared at Arthur, then at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Arthur did not waver. His gaze was like granite. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he was standing on my side of it. Finally, Sterling let out a huff. "Fine. Whatever. Just get me the book." He threw the words at me, but the venom was gone, replaced by a sullen compliance. I retrieved the book, wrapped it with precise, careful hands, and processed the sale. Sterling paid in silence and left without another word, the bell on the door sounding jarringly cheerful in his wake. When he was gone, I stood behind the counter, my hands flat on the cool wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt shaken, but also defended. Seen. He had stood up for me, not just as an employee, but as a person of value. Arthur walked over to the counter. The formidable coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. I looked up at him, and I'm sure he saw the turmoil of gratitude and emotion in my eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Thank you, Arthur." It was the first time I had used his first name in the public space of the shop, in the light of day. It felt like a deliberate step, a crossing of a threshold. He didn't correct me. He didn't flinch. His expression softened, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "No one should speak to you that way," he said. "Your work is exemplary. I value it. I value you." The last 3 words hung in the air between us, simple, direct, and utterly transformative. I value you. It was a confession, disguised as a professional reassurance. But the way he said it, the way his gaze held mine, left no room for doubt. He wasn't just talking about my skills as a bookkeeper. That evening, the atmosphere in the library was different yet again. The comfortable tension had been replaced by a palpable, humming awareness. We worked, but the silence was thick with unspoken things. Every time our eyes met, it was like a jolt of electricity. The public defense had changed the equation. He had made his feelings clear in a way that could not be taken back. Now, the next move was mine. He brought me a cup of tea, his custom when we worked late. He set it on the table beside my ledger, his fingers brushing the back of my hand as he did so. This time, I didn't pull away. I turned my hand over, my palm up, a silent invitation. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then his fingers lightly intertwined with mine. His skin was warm, his touch gentle but firm. We sat there for a long moment, our hands clasped on the table, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the soft whisper of our breathing. He finally withdrew his hand, but his eyes stayed on mine. The air was so charged I could barely breathe. He had taken a risk in the shop, a public one, and now he was waiting. He was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to step forward and meet him. He gestured to a stray lock of hair that had fallen across my forehead. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. It was such a small thing, but the question was enormous. It was a direct, spoken request for permission to touch me, an explicit acknowledgement of consent that honored me and erased any lingering fear of the power imbalance between us. He was not assuming. He was asking. I could only nod, my throat tight with emotion. Slowly, he reached out. His fingers were infinitely gentle as he tucked the strand of hair behind my ear. His knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of my temple, sending a shiver down my spine. His hand lingered there, his thumb stroking my cheekbone in a soft, mesmerizing rhythm. His eyes searched mine, asking 1,000 questions without a single word. I leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement, and his expression softened into one of relief and profound tenderness. The confrontation was over. We had met in the middle. The only thing left was to speak the truth aloud. The project was nearing its end. Only a few boxes remained. The neat stacks of index cards were a testament to our shared work, but all I could feel was a creeping sense of dread. Soon, this would be over. The contract would be fulfilled. Our evenings would end. I would go back to being the clerk behind the counter, and he would retreat back to his world above the shop. The thought of returning to that distance, to that polite formality, was unbearable. The silence between us, once a comfort, now felt like a ticking clock, counting down the minutes until we were lost to each other again. It was another rainy night. The rhythmic drumming against the window panes was a familiar, soothing sound, but tonight it did nothing to calm the anxiety coiling in my gut. Arthur was standing by the window, his back to me, looking out at the rain-slicked street below. His silhouette was a dark, solid shape against the blurred city lights. He was so still, so contained, and I was a mess of turmoil inside. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that if I didn't speak now, I never would. The moment would pass. Fear would reassert its hold, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering, what if I thought of the lonely years, the quiet, empty apartment, the life lived at a safe distance? I did not want that life anymore. I wanted this. I wanted the warmth of this room, the shared silence, the quiet respect, the gentle touch of his hand. I wanted him. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were clammy, but I stood up from my chair. The scrape of the legs on the wood floor was loud in the quiet room. He turned, his expression questioning. I took a breath, a ragged, shaky thing. This is it. This is the moment. Now or never. "Arthur," I said. My voice was not as steady as I would have liked, but it was clear. He waited, his gray eyes fixed on me, patient and watchful. "The work is almost finished," I began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. And I don't want this to end there. It was. The truth laid bare. It hung in the air between us, fragile and momentous. I had taken the ultimate risk, confessed my desire not for a job, but for a connection. I braced myself for the gentle letdown, the kind, professional redirection. He didn't move for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the dim light, and a cold wave of panic washed over me. I had made a terrible mistake. I had misread everything. I had ruined the one good thing in my life. Then, he pushed away from the window and closed the distance between us in 3 long, silent strides. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Nor do I, Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated through my very bones. "Nor do I." He looked down at me, his gaze intense, searching. "I have come to value this time," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal. "To value you, more than I can properly express." The relief was so powerful it almost made my knees buckle. He felt it too. I wasn't alone in this. I hadn't been imagining it. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. He didn't touch me, not yet. His hand hovered in the space between us. His knuckles gently, so gently, grazed my cheek. The touch was feather-light, a question. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't find my voice. I could only nod, a short, jerky movement. My eyes were locked on his, and in their depths, I saw years of my own loneliness reflected and understood. That was all the confirmation he needed. He leaned in, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between our lips. The kiss, when it came, was not what I had expected. It wasn't a spark of passion, but a settling. It was not a fire, but a hearth. It was slow, and deep, and breathtakingly tender. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a quiet confirmation of everything that had passed between us in weeks of shared silence and stolen glances. It tasted of coffee and wine and a rightness so absolute it felt like coming home. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed. He brought his other hand up to cup my face, his thumb stroking my cheeks. His breath was warm against my lips. "Leo," he whispered, my name a prayer. I opened my eyes and found him watching me, his expression one of overwhelming, vulnerable tenderness. I reached up and laced my fingers with the hand that was not on my face. The weight of his hand in mine, the solid, real feel of our palms pressed together, was an anchor in a swirling sea of emotion. It was real. This was happening. We stood there for a long time, foreheads touching, hands clasped, simply breathing together in the lamplit quiet of the library. The rain had stopped. Outside the window, the world was washed clean, and inside, I felt the same. The years of guarded isolation, of quiet yearning, were over. A door had been locked for so long I had forgotten it was there, and this man, this kind, steady, honorable man, had just handed me the key. The next morning, everything felt strange, hyperreal and fragile at the same time. The world looked the same, the autumn sun casting long shadows on my walk to work, but my entire internal landscape had been redrawn. I felt exposed, my heart raw and open. The memory of the kiss, of the feeling of his hand in mine, was a constant, warm hum beneath my skin. When I entered the shop, the familiar scent of old paper and polish felt different. It was no longer just the smell of my workplace. It was intertwined with the scent of his home, of him. I took my place behind the counter, my movements automatic, my mind 1,000 miles away, upstairs. A little after 9, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. My stomach did a nervous flip. This was it. The first moment in the light of day. How would we be? What would we say? He came into the shop, dressed for the day in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers. He looked exactly as he always did, calm, composed, in control. He walked to the counter to pick up the morning paper, a daily ritual. "Good morning, Leo," he said. His voice was polite, professional, exactly the same tone he had used with me for 3 years. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," I replied, the name slipping out from force of habit. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. He didn't correct me. He simply nodded, placed a few coins on the counter for the paper, and turned to leave. He paused at the door. "We have a delivery from the binder at 11. Please make sure the invoice is correct." And then he was gone, back up the stairs. I stared at the coins on the counter, my mind reeling. It was as if last night had never happened. The formality, the distance, it was all back, a wall erected between us. My internal monologue began to spiral into a panicked frenzy. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness brought on by the storm and the wine. He regretted it. Of course he did. He was my boss. He was Arthur Vance. What could he possibly see in me? I was a fool to have thought it could be anything more. The shame was so intense it was a physical sickness, churning in my gut. I had misread everything, and now I had to face the consequence. This cold, polite, unbearable distance. The day was torture. Every chime of the bell made me jump. Every customer I helped felt like a performance, a hollow charade of normalcy, while my inner world was collapsing. I kept my eyes down, focused on my work, trying not to think about the man moving around in the apartment just above my head. As 5 o'clock approached, my dread intensified. I didn't know if I could face another evening in the library, pretending nothing had happened. Maybe he would tell me the project was finished, that my assistance was no longer needed. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. I was closing the register, my movements stiff and clumsy, when he came down the stairs again. I braced myself. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "Could you stay for a moment after you lock up?" This is it, I thought. The gentle firing. The "this isn't working out" speech. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I locked the front door and turned off the lights, the familiar routine feeling like a funereal rite. I walked to the back of the shop, where he was waiting by his small office. He gestured for me to enter, and I did, feeling like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He closed the door behind us, shutting out the cavernous, shadowy space of the main shop. He didn't go behind the desk. He stood in front of it, just a few feet from me, his hands in his pockets. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low and serious. I looked up, surprised. "What for?" "For this morning," he said. He looked pained, his brow furrowed. I was uncertain how to act. "I saw the look on your face when I used that tone, when I walked away. I realized I had hurt you, and that is the last thing on this earth I ever want to do." He took a breath, and the confession poured out of him. I panicked, Leo. In the light of day, all the old worries came rushing back. The fact that I'm your employer. The difference in our ages. I didn't want to presume. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable in your own workspace, to put you in a position where you felt you had to perform for me. So I retreated to what was familiar, to what felt safe. It was clumsy, and it was unfair to you after what we shared last night. The knot of ice in my stomach began to melt, replaced by a tentative, fragile warmth. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been trying to protect me. "I don't regret last night," he said, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Not for a second. But I also respect your position here. This shop is your livelihood. It's your space, too." He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "So I propose a boundary, if you agree. Here, in the shop, during business hours, we are what we have always been. I am Mr. Vance, your employer. You are Leo, my valued colleague. It keeps things clear. It protects you from any perception of impropriety. It keeps your professional life your own." He paused. "But our personal time, the evenings, the weekends, that is for us. For Arthur and Leo. Does that seem fair to you?" It was the most thoughtful, respectful solution I could have imagined. He wasn't dismissing what had happened. He was building a structure around it, a framework designed for my safety and comfort. He was addressing the power imbalance head-on and creating a way for us to navigate it with integrity. A wave of profound gratitude washed over me. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's very fair. Thank you." He reached out and took my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. The simple, deliberate touch was a reassurance, a confirmation that the connection from last night was real and wanted. "Good," he said, a real smile finally lighting his eyes. "Now, I believe we still have a few boxes to catalog." He squeezed my hand gently. "If you're up for it." The relief and joy were so overwhelming that I laughed, a short, breathless sound. "I'm up for it." The next test came a few days later, in the form of Mrs. Gable, a regular customer and the town's most notorious gossip. She came in to purchase a book on gardening, and she found me discussing a new acquisition with Arthur, who had come down to the shop floor to inspect a binding. We were standing closer than we normally would, our heads bent over the book, our conversation easy and familiar. Mrs. Gable watched us from the counter, her eyes sharp and assessing. As I rang up her purchase, she leaned in conspiratorially. Well, she said in a stage whisper. You seem to have gotten quite friendly with the reclusive Mr. Vance. All those late nights must be paying off. Getting some special treatment, are we? A year ago, a comment like that would have sent me into a spiral of flushing, stammering panic. But something had settled in me. I felt the solid ground of Arthur's respect beneath my feet. I simply smiled, a calm, neutral expression. Mr. Vance has been very generous with his knowledge, I said, my voice even. I've learned a great deal. Will that be cash or card? My placid, professional response gave her nowhere to go. Her attempted jab had glanced off harmlessly. She paid for her book, her lips pursed in disappointment, and left. Arthur had been in the back office, but the door had been ajar. He had heard the entire exchange. When she was gone, he came out. He didn't say anything, but he walked over to where I was standing and placed a hand on my shoulder, giving it a brief, firm squeeze. He was looking at me with an expression of quiet pride. In that moment, we were a team, a united front. The gossip of the outside world was just noise. It couldn't touch what we were building. The Callaway project was finally complete. The last book was cataloged, the last index card filed. The massive library table was clear for the first time in weeks. A tangible chapter of our story had come to an end, and we were now standing on the precipice of a new, undefined beginning. That night, after we put the last ledger away, we didn't start a new task. We simply stood in the quiet library, the air thick with anticipation. The question of what now hung between us. Arthur was the one to speak. He didn't beat around the bush. He faced me directly, his expression open and serious. I don't want to go back to the way things were, Leo, he said. I want more. With you. If that is something you want as well, it is, I said, the words coming out without a trace of hesitation. It's what I want, he nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement. Then we must be conscious about how we proceed. I want to build this with you, not impose it on you. He walked over to a small desk in the corner and picked up a single, old-fashioned brass key. He came back and held it out to me on his open palm. This is the key to the private entrance downstairs, he said. The one that leads up to this apartment. I want you to have it. He saw the look of surprise on my face and held up a hand. This is not an expectation. It is not a demand for you to move in or spend every night here. It is an invitation. It means you are welcome here, always. Come and go as you please. This space is as much yours as you want it to be. No pressure, no obligation. Just a key to a door, should you ever wish to open it. I looked from the key, gleaming in his palm, to his earnest, hopeful face. It was the most profound gift I had ever been given. It wasn't just a key. It was an offering of trust, of home, of agency. He was giving me the power, the choice. He was making me his equal in the only way that truly mattered. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached out and took the key from his hand. It felt heavy, solid, and warm from his touch. Thank you, I whispered, my throat tight. He closed his hand over mine, his fingers curling around the key and my own. Welcome home, Leo. I didn't use the key for several days. I carried it in my pocket, its weight a constant, comforting presence. It felt too momentous, too significant for a casual weekday evening. I waited until Sunday. The shop was closed. It was our time. I let myself in through the private side door, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I climbed the familiar stairs, but this time it was different. I wasn't an employee coming to work. I was something else. I was coming home. I found him in his kitchen, a bright, airy room I had never seen before. He was sitting at a small table by the window, wearing a soft, comfortable-looking robe, reading the Sunday paper and drinking coffee. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into a smile so warm and genuine it took my breath away. He looked completely at ease, completely happy to see me. Good morning, he said, his voice soft with sleep. Morning, I replied, feeling a little shy. I hope I'm not intruding. Never, he said, his eyes crinkling. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Coffee's fresh. Mugs are in the cupboard to your left. I went to the cupboard, my movements feeling strangely natural. I took down a mug, poured myself a coffee, and sat down at the table with him. The simple domesticity of the act was so profound it almost made me dizzy. We were just two people, sharing a quiet Sunday morning. It wasn't a grand spectacle. It was a simple, quiet intimacy that felt more real, more solid, than any dramatic declaration could. We sat for a while in companionable silence, reading our sections of the paper, the comfortable quiet that had first defined our relationship now imbued with a new depth of affection. Later, we took our coffee out onto a small balcony that overlooked the rooftops of the city. The morning air was cool and crisp. We stood side by side, leaning on the railing, watching the city wake up. I looked over at him, at his strong profile against the morning sky, and a feeling of immense peace settled over me. All the fear and loneliness that had been my constant companions for so long had receded. They were still part of my story, part of what had brought me here, but they were no longer the whole narrative. They had been replaced by this steady, quiet warmth. The differences between us were still there, of course. He was older. He was wealthier. Those were immutable facts. But sitting here, in the easy quiet of a shared morning, they felt like just that, facts. They were like the color of his eyes, or the scent of his books, or the silver at his temples. They were the context, not the story itself. The story was about care. It was about respect. It was about a man who used his resources not to control, but to create a space of safety and choice. And it was about a younger man who was finally brave enough to accept that safety, to step into that space and claim it as his own. It was a partnership built on a foundation of quiet observation, mutual trust, and the courage to finally speak. He turned his head and caught me looking at him. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He just smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and reached over to take my hand. His fingers laced with mine, a familiar, anchoring weight. The sun was rising higher, casting a golden glow over the sleeping city, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.